I want to discuss with you the differences between time's arrow and time's wheel. These are worldviews that help explain cosmology and history. Time's arrow tends to think of time moving in a forward direction. Time's wheel is about repetition and patterns. In the West, we typically rely on time's arrow to describe events and our understanding of the universe. Many indigenous groups around the world use time's wheel. Time's wheel has been employed by groups like the Maya, the Aztecs, the Blackfoot, the Sioux, and the Yoruba. So we can see groups from all over the world, Africa, North America, South America, have used a repetition or cyclical way of looking at time. Where in the West, we tend to look at things in terms of cause and effect or past, present, and future. So the large difference here between the two not only informs the way someone sees the world, but understands their place in the world. A lot of my research comes directly from F. David Peat. So Peat was a holistic physicist, and he was an author to try to popularize physical ideas. He carried out a lot of his research in solid state physics, and also was a member or a founder of the quantum theory. Okay, so one of the things that Pete struggled with, and is still an issue for modern science today, was unifying the theories of quantum and gravity. Or in other words, as Einstein had said it, the very, very big, massive macro forces that work on galaxies and the universe, and the very, very infinitesimal, the tiny subatomic worlds. The problem is these two worlds tend not to work very well. One of the largest things that Pete argues is there's two reasons for this. One is we have yet to find a particle that carries the power of gravity. We have particles that understand things like the forces of electromagnetism, the strong and weak forces, but we don't have one for gravity. There are some theorized ones, but we have not discovered them yet. Another thing that Pete had argued was it's the way we think. Although science is an incredible model and has allowed us to understand the universe in really robust ways, it's limited. The questions we create in science are limited by the model of science. And so what Pete decided to do was to try to break that model and look for outside influences. And so one of the groups he spent a lot of time with were the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot have a model of physics which rivals Western ideas. And that model of physics comes largely from a times wheel model. All right, so based on Pete's work and based on my understandings of some of these cultures that work on times wheel, I want to describe for you some of the differences here. My hope is also to dispel the noble savage and the savage myth. A lot of times in the West, when we look at indigenous groups of the world, we do one of two things. We either think of them as savages because they don't live and think and act in the same way that Westerners do. That's been the historical way of describing people's indigenous cultures. Or we call them noble savages. We put them on this pedestal and believe that they can do no wrong, right? So the classic example of this is looking at a Native American person and thinking that they're perfect because they're a Native American, right? They're in harmony with nature, they're in tune with the natural world, they're morally superior, they're better because they are who they are. When in reality, neither the savage nor the noble savage are correct models. The savage obviously paints a pejorative picture of the person and makes them seem less than human and dehumanizes them. The noble savage glorifies them to the point where they're not human again, right? They now are a model or a representation that is beyond human and is ideal. Neither are true. Indigenous peoples are peoples, just like everybody else. And to portray them otherwise is racist and pejorative. So what we're trying to do here is to show that it's not that people who lived in this worldview are lesser or better than people in this worldview. It's to say that they're just different and that there's overlap between them. Okay, I'm going to start with time's arrow because that's probably the most familiar with most people. It's what Westerners typically think the world works. We look at things like models of time, history, cosmology, congruence and harmony, and how the world works from a macro and a micro standpoint. We tend to think there's a past, which leads to a present, which is moving towards a future. This is known as time's arrow because it is moving in one direction just as an arrow does. An arrow is fired from the past and moves towards a future location. In the West, we tend to think this is how the universe works. There's the Big Bang explodes, creates all of the elements and molecules that we have in the universe today. We've got galaxies and superclusters and stars and solar systems and planets. And on those planets, we have actions like geothermal actions and geological actions, which then lead to biological actions, which lead to life, right? We've got this nice, neat picture of past through future. Okay, that leads to the idea that there's progress, and that leads to the idea of causality being cause and effect. One of the problems Peat had run into, and many quantum physicists had run into, is that cause and effect is a bias by the observer. We tend to think that's the case, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is true. That just happens to be the way that we live. And it's just as plausible that the reverse could be true, that effects could precede causes, or that future does not have to come or after the past. Basically, what Peat was trying to understand was, what other ways could we see things? Does it have to move in this time's arrows way? Well, it turns out there are a handful of other models, and they largely base things in tradition, repetition and pattern, cycles like seasons or life cycles, meaning that there really isn't a clear distinction between past and future, but because things repeat over and over and over again, future leads back into the past, and there's an endless cycle of the repetition, right? This is sometimes represented by this kind of diagram, a four-part diagram, which represents things like the seasons or the transitions between states. It's sometimes known as a medicine wheel. We have large versions of this, which are made out of massive stone structures. We have tiny versions of this, which are painted or crafted. And basically the idea behind it is that there really is no starting point or ending point. There just is. This is, by the way, not only unique to indigenous groups. There are many Eastern philosophies and Western philosophies that came to this conclusion as well, that time is cyclical. Okay. What's interesting about this for me is that because of time is cyclical, many of the groups that live in these kinds of worldviews believe that the purpose of life isn't necessarily progress or moving forward, but is to maintain a steady state. This is where that myth of Native American groups or indigenous groups are in harmony with nature. It's not necessarily that there's some kind of like spiritual, metaphysical connection there, although some groups do profess that. But in other words, it might just be the simple fact that maintaining tradition and maintaining lifestyles that are consistent leads to this kind of balance. There is a price to progress, just as there is a price to tradition. The price of progress is that as we continue to move forward as a society, we tend to use up our resources and have to physically move. We have to move from place to place to gather more resources. And as we grow more people and maximize our population, we end up having to move and take on more resources. That's the price of progress. The benefit of progress, though, is things like technology, things like medical science, the ability to prolong life, the ability to minimize tragedy during things like childbirth or sickness, right? Those are the benefits of progress. The benefits of tradition is that if you maintain